Boa tarde a todos e todas. Iniciaremos em breve a palestra internacional com a professora Helen Petrie. Há um canal com link no chat com a tradução simultânea em português. Perguntas podem ser feitas no chat em português ou em inglês a qualquer momento. Passaremos agora para a apresentação da palestra em inglês. A very warm welcome to everyone. We have the pleasure to announce today's keynote speaker. It's an honor to welcome Professor Helen Petrie to share her extensive experience with research on accessibility and diversity in interactive systems, with a close dialogue with this year's theme in our symposium. Helen Petrie is a Professor Emerita in the Computer Science Department at the University of York, working in the field of computer science with an emphasis on human-computer interaction, HCI. She has nearly 30 years of internationally recognized research into new technologies for people with disabilities and older people to improve their quality of life and well-being. Her current interests are particularly in the area of supporting older people to live independently in their own homes for longer. She has been involved in over 30 British and international projects in the area and has been published widely. She has received a Technical Innovation Award from the Royal Television Society, a Social Impact Award from the Association of Computing Machinery, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Royal National Institute for Blind People, and this week, the Silver Core Award from the International Federation of Information Processing, IFIP, for promoting HCI internationally. She is a licensed psychologist and a member of the British Psychological Society and the British Computer Society. On a personal note, I had the honor of having Professor Helen Petrie as one of my PhD supervisors with Dr. Christopher Power. I am indebted to her for the important lessons she had that helped significantly to shape the HCI researcher I've become. I am happy that the HCI community in Brazil will have the opportunity to learn from Helen's extensive experience in HCI research and her contribution and advocacy for diversity and people with disabilities in accessibility research and practice. Thank you very much, Helen, for accepting our invitation and for being with us today. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Professor Helen Petrie for her keynote.
Andre, thank you for that lovely invitation, and I'm very honored to be talking with you today. It seems very strange to be giving this talk from my kitchen, which I think you can see behind me. And are my slides showing on the screen okay, Andre?
I think not yet. It's going...
Hang on. Oh, the technology isn't working this time. I think we're coming. How about that? Is they showing now?
Yes. Now it went through okay.
Okay, good. Technology never works when you want it to. So I'm amazed that I've now been working for nearly 3 decades, for nearly 30 years on the topics of accessibility and assistive technology. And I wanted to call this talk, Are We There Yet, Greg? So I don't know whether it's the same in Portuguese, but in English, if you're on a long car trip or a train trip with your children and the children are always saying, Are we there yet, Mum? Are we there yet, Mum? And Greg van der Heijden is one of the leading figures in the field of accessibility. So are we there yet in making technology accessible to disabled and older people? So Today I want to talk a little bit about myself and how I got what my journey was in researching accessibility and assistive technology, and then talk about two strands of work in this field, one of which is kind of accessibility, which is making mainstream technologies accessible to people, and the other one is assistive technology, using new technologies to assist disabled and older people. And then I want to briefly mention something that's kind of a third strand, but that's something interesting, and that is that we go from mainstream technology to helping people with disabilities and older people, but actually there's also a flow in the opposite direction of assistive technologies, or technologies which start off as being assistive, enter the mainstream and help everybody. And I think that's something good to remember to motivate ourselves. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the methods of doing HCI research with disabled and older people, particularly because that's something I've been working on more recently. So just a little bit about how I got to where I am today. I'm actually Australian by nationality. I spent my early years in Melbourne, Australia, but I also grew up partly in Switzerland and Italy because my father worked for the United Nations, and I've lived as an adult in France and Sweden as well as the UK. So I actually think I'm much more European than many of my British friends. And one of the funny things about my career was I went to university when I was about 20 to study computer science, and I hated it. And I didn't really understand what it was all about, which now I realize was partly due to rather poor teaching of computer science. And I was one of only 2 girls in a class of 106. That didn't particularly bother me, but all the boys seemed to know what this was about, and I didn't know what it was about. So I swapped to psychology, and I loved psychology, and I understood psychology. And then I came to the UK. I was very lucky to get a scholarship to do a PhD in psychology. I did my PhD, and I'd always been quite scientific. So I worked as a teaching assistant to a real statistician, as I called him, a very excellent and interesting statistician who was teaching psychology students statistics. And that was important because when I started lecturing myself as a junior lecturer in psychology, I was asked to teach statistics because generally psychologists are not very statistically or mathematically minded. And in those days, we taught statistics using statistical software packages. If you've ever heard of SPSS, for example, that was the early days of SPSS. But the students had to access these big software packages on mainframe computers. So they had to negotiate the operating system, which in those days was a command line system, to get the software, the stats package to run. And then they had to use a different command line system to interact with the software package. And the psychology students, as well as many of the lecturers, just found this completely baffling. So they would put commands for the operating system, which was Unix. They'd put those into the software package and get errors, or they'd put the software package commands straight into the operating system and get errors. And that really fascinated me. So why did they find it so hard? And perhaps because I speak a number of languages, having grown up in Switzerland and Italy, I just thought, well, it's like speaking Italian and French. What's so difficult about that? I know when to speak Italian, I know when to speak French. but they found this very difficult. And also I thought, well, why can't it be made easier? Why do we have to go through all this kerfuffle? So that's how I got interested in human-computer interaction. I discovered there was this field, human-computer interaction. At the time, we're talking the late 1980s. To be honest, I found particularly the work in the UK being done in HCI was a bit dry. It was about creating models, but they weren't very interesting models. But then my professor came back from the States and he said, I've got this amazing new portable computer. And I thought he'd gone mad because he lifted this great big brick. It weighed about 10 kilos. And I thought, well, what's portable about that? And he turned on this tiny little screen. And there were these little pictures on the screen because he'd bought an Apple II. And that kind of began to change my life. At first, I kept on thinking, where's the operating system gone? But then I began to learn about graphical user interfaces and how they could make life much easier for non-technical people. Whoops, right. So I became interested in human-computer interaction. And at that stage, it was a much more technically based field, and I felt I wasn't being taken seriously by computer scientists, and I wanted to understand more. I didn't want to become a computer scientist, but I wanted to understand more about how they worked so I could work with them. So I took a year off my lectureship and I did an MSc in computer science. And this time I understood what computer science was about and I really loved it. I actually loved programming, but I knew I didn't want to be a programmer. And then quite by chance, towards the end of my MSc, I saw an ad for a job with the Royal National Institute for Blind People. And they said they wanted someone to look at computer access for blind people, and they wanted a psychologist. And I'm still not sure why they thought they wanted a psychologist. I think it was actually a bit of a mistake. But I applied. I took another 2 years off my lectureship. My university I was working with at the time thought I was never going to come back, which was true. And I was lucky enough to work on one of the first projects to make graphical user interfaces accessible to blind people. I'll come to that in a minute. But that kind of changed my life completely. I became very passionate about this area. It's absorbed me ever since, and I love doing research in this area. So that's how I came to, people say, well, do you have lots of disabled people in your family? Is that why you're doing this research? And I say, no, actually, I do have a few disabled people in my family, but we never thought of them as disabled. We just thought of them as a bit different, which is interesting as well, but a different story. So quite early on in my career in this area, I wrote a paper and I looked back at it last week and thought, actually, that was quite good for when I was just discovering the area. And in that paper, I argued that there are two strands of work going on that we need to think about, and you can choose to work in one or the other. They have slightly different aims. So the first one is about ensuring access to mainstream technologies. And we live in an age where there are constant technological innovations. I mean, in the time I've worked in the area, I saw the beginning of the GUIs and then the smartphones, apps, all. I would like to work out whether there has been more technological innovation in the past 30 years than in the previous 100 years, for example. And increasingly, using new technologies is not just something you can do, but you can't function in life without being able to use the technologies. And for example, government services in the UK now are online only. So if you can't use the online version, you're really disadvantaged. You're under the digital divide. And I think the pandemic that we're in at the moment has actually greatly increased that movement towards digital only. So it's very important that mainstream technologies are designed so that the most people in society can use them, so that they can participate in society and be able to access goods and services. So that's one really important strand of work. But the other very important strand of work is that as new technologies come along, people often can think of ways in which this technology could help the quality of life of disabled and older people in some way. It could solve the problem or solve a problem that people have in daily life. Sadly, I often encounter people who have an idea about how to use a new technology for a problem that disabled people don't have. So you've got to be careful there, but there have been tremendous developments. So a thing at the moment I'm a little bit hesitant about is I have a lot of young researchers saying to me, well, voice assistants like Alexa or Siri are going to solve all the problems of disabled people. There's nothing left to do. And I think, I'm not sure about that. It may solve some problems, but I want to see some specific, what problem are you going to address and how will it solve the problem? So I think we've made good progress in each of these two strands in the time I've been researching. I'm going to give you a couple of examples and talk about challenges that still remain that you might be interested in. And finally, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about the fact that a lot is perhaps an exaggeration. There is a surprising number of mainstream technological developments that actually started life as work for disabled or older people. So I think we should be aware, and as a community of computer scientists and HCI researchers, we should be promoting what assistive technology has done for society in general. It's not only what technology does for disabled people, it's what technology for disabled people has helped the wider community. So it's quite hard to track some of these crossovers, and I'd like to research that in the next couple of years. Just going to take a drink of, this is not wine, this is juice. So as I mentioned, the very first job I had with the Royal National Institute for Blind People was about giving blind and partially sighted people access to a graphical user interface, and they were just becoming really mainstream at that point. Believe it or not, we worked on Windows 3, and we were working on both a solution which would take what was on the screen, or actually behind the screen, what was in the computer, and instead of turning it into text, to turn it into speech or to turn it into Braille on a Braille display. And at that stage, there was a lot of publicity about how graphical user interfaces were going to make computing much easier, which of course they did. And blind and partially sighted people were rightly very worried that they would lose access to a system that they'd only fairly recently begun to have access to, but computing on a command line system worked very well for a screen reader or a Braille display. So at that stage, you had a lot of blind people learning to be programmers and who were very good programmers. And they thought that this was going to be taken away from them. So the other thing which was interesting at this time was that at this point, Apple was not doing very well. So the real market leader was Microsoft with Windows. It looked as if Microsoft would wipe the floor with Apple, which is interesting the way things have turned around. And Microsoft were extremely obstructive. They wouldn't give us access to the internal working of the operating system. They kept on insisting that was a security risk that they couldn't possibly do. So it was very hard for us to create a system. We had to use kind of strange workarounds. And then a little bit later, they also washed their hands of the problem and said, well, it was up to other organizations to create screen readers for blind people and screen magnification programs for partially sighted people. That wasn't their business. And in fact, that has continued to make life very difficult, because creating the software for a screen reader is a very difficult job. You need to be a really, really expert programmer, and it's hard for such a small market to attract really high-class programmers to work in that area. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And one of the interesting things was that Apple then shamed Microsoft by building screen reading software and many other assistive capabilities into their machines, so that every Apple machine has always had the capability to speak, to enlarge the text and do many things, and it was free. They weren't the software wasn't terribly good initially, but now the software is just great. But software, screen reading software, both for converting text to speech or text to Braille on all platforms, has developed enormously and is now very sophisticated. And indeed, I have blind friends who I think they're probably faster on their iPhones than I am as a visual user of my iPhone. And I'll come back to this much later, but one of the things is I think that's because Apple have actually developed the visual version of the software and the version that's based on gestures and speech in parallel, not one after the other. So they both work really well. So I think it's a pity Apple are very secretive about their methods, because I've found out a certain amount about how they do it, and it's really very impressive. So one of the problems that hasn't been solved, although I think we're now on the cusp of solving it, is that for visually impaired people, for totally blind people in particular, using Braille is a really good solution. It is slower than speech, but it's very accurate. It's very good for programming, for example. And people who have learned Braille like to use Braille. It's like if I suddenly said to you, you can't have print books anymore. You can only have audio books. Many people would really miss the print book, and Braille is the print equivalent for blind people. Now, until recently, very recently, Braille displays for computing and for note-taking and for working with mobile phones have been very expensive. There's a story behind that I don't really have time to go into, which is to do with the patents on the technology. So, for example, a typical Braille display that you will still see on the market starts from about 2,500 American dollars and can go up to, for a big one, maybe $7,000. Recently, the Royal National Institute for the Blind put together a worldwide consortium of 30 different organizations, universities, and companies who were all trying to develop a different technology to do the refreshable Braille. So the device at the top uses piezoelectric cells, which all move up and down independently, and there are patents on that process. But even without the patents, the fact that each one has to be independently addressable, it has to move independently, makes it very expensive. Now, after some years of work, the Orbit Consortium, as they're called, which was initiated by the Royal National Institute for Blind People, has produced a Braille display that brings the price down by an order of magnitude. So this is the equivalent, the new device, which has only been available for a couple of years, and it costs, the very basic one costs about 400 American dollars. That's the starting price. There are more expensive ones, and there are still some teething problems that they're perhaps not as reliable as they should be, but that's a real breakthrough. I think there's still a need to investigate different technologies to produce Braille, but it's such a small market. It's not a commercially viable enterprise. It has to be charities. And for example, there are some charitable organizations in India that I've worked with who are working on this. On speech, an interesting thing has happened in that JAWS, which stands for, actually I can't remember what JAWS stands for, but it's something about speech access, but that takes what would typically be on the screen and turns it into speech for the text. So that's still the market leader. It costs about 1,500 American dollars on top of the price of a computer. So it's still very expensive, but it's still very widely used, and it's a very sophisticated program. But there is now a free open source equivalent called non-visual something access, NVDA, and that's free. And again, it started off not being terribly good, but lots of people have worked on that. It was actually started by an Australian blind man, and it's now actually really a competitor. And a lot of blind people I know have both JAWS and NVDA, and they say they both have strengths and weaknesses, and they swap around between one or the other. So I think there's still room for improvement in that area. There's still research need there. But I haven't perhaps quite emphasized that this is only for access to text. And of course, a lot of what we now receive through our devices, our computing devices, is images and graphics. So screen readers can cope with the buttons and that kind of navigation because you don't need to know that that's a graphic. It's just a functional element. But if you actually have a picture or a graphic of some kind that's really part of the experience, and indeed then when you think about YouTube, think of all the video information on YouTube. There's been very little progress on how to make this kind of visual material accessible particularly to totally blind people, and more accessible to partially sighted people. So we're still using very traditional manual methods for making tactile diagrams. We have repeated attempts to use this piezoelectric cell technology that's used in the Braille displays of pins going up and down to create graphics displays. And this is where I get a bit frustrated, because this happens over and over again, and it's not really a good solution. Visually impaired people, totally blind people, can't really understand what a graphic is about just from the sense of touch. It's partly because they haven't had enough experience. But if you start touching that image of the bird, whether you're sighted or blind, if as a sighted person, if you were blindfolded and you tried to feel it, you would not understand it. Now, being blindfolded as a sighted person is not the same as being blind, but I just use that as an illustration. What you need, and we do have the technical capability of now, is an audio tactile device. You need to be able to touch the bird and the system say to you, this is the head. Perhaps it can describe the color. This is, I have no idea what kind of bird that is, but this is the head. The feathers here would typically be gray, etc., etc. And then the tactile experience complements the audio experience and probably helps someone form a mental model. So this could be done, but nobody's doing it. And I think there's a huge opportunity here to combine HCI work, material science work for the piezoelectric cells or some other technology, artificial intelligence to provide automatic description of some of the diagram, which may still need human assistance as well, and image processing. So there's a really good area there that could be developed and would be really beneficial to visually impaired people. Another mainstream technology, I've talked to you about Windows. Of course, the other big technological innovation, which I failed to mention, was just starting when I started work in this area, is the World Wide Web. So that's changed the way we all consume information, regardless of our ability to process text or diagrams or whatever. And then the next stage was the extensive development of apps as a way of interacting with information on smartphones that have changed the game almost again. And Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the web, certainly understood, or someone told him to say this. There's actually a story behind this quote, but someone told him to say this, which was very true, that the power of the web is in its universality, and access for everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential component. Central aspect. So this is based on the principle that the coding of the web, HTML and all the other code that's come along since then, is not visual. It's code, and you can render that visually, or you can render it in speech or Braille, for the text at least. The images, as we've seen, is a separate problem. So if you separate the presentation from the content, that should then be very easy to create different renderings. Unfortunately, the development world has not really risen to that challenge. And the web is kind of accessible, particularly to people with visual disabilities, and they find very helpful, but it's much more of a struggle for them than it is for sighted people. So we've half solved this problem, but we really need to continue working on this. And people often think, oh, I'm going to blame web developers for not working hard enough on this. And I think that's really unfair. I think the problems are, and if you're in education, in higher education, I think we're not teaching enough about accessibility in our computer science programs, both for HCI and perhaps for broader computer science developments. We need to be doing more there. And I think people do think that the web is somehow visual. So that principle of separating content and presentation has not lasted. We need to go back to that. And the other thing I would say is that I think the guidelines that have been developed by the Web Consortium are too difficult for developers to understand. And it's got the kind of incremental creep that many technologies have, that people know they're not quite working, so they make it more complicated and they make it more complicated. And that hasn't helped. And also perhaps companies and institutions just don't value disabled and older people enough and don't realize how important they are as part of society. That is changing slowly, I think, but we need to, that's a big societal problem still. So I think there are still barriers that we need to work on. And the other thing, kind of as a consequence of this, both for the web but also for all mainstream technologies, is the entire time I've been working in the field, we have this problem of constantly playing catch up. So people develop a technology, and that's why I mentioned Apple as being, to some extent, an exception to this with their screen reader for the iPhone. But normally what happens is people launch a new mainstream technology, a technological innovation. They design it for themselves, and they tend to be young white men in San Francisco, I'm afraid. And then somehow people realize this is not accessible to older people or people with visual disabilities, or some group of people. So some kind of retrofit is made, and that causes two big problems. It's usually very expensive, and it's not an optimal solution. So you get a clunky solution, unlike the screen reader on the iPhone, where you feel, actually, this is a really elegant solution and fits very nicely into the whole package. So we do need to push for getting people to think about this early on, even in a general way. And that's where I think education is very important. We need to educate young designers and developers and programmers, right? The whole group of people who might be working on an innovation in terms of inclusive design and accessibility principles. And the other thing is, I think I've done a lot of teaching of web developers, professional web developers, and they kind of go, oh, yeah, well, we have to think about accessibility as if it's something awful that they have to think about. I think when we teach about inclusive design and accessibility, we need to present it as an interesting intellectual challenge. Okay, we're making the problem a bit more difficult, but you're really clever people, come up with good solutions here. And this is where it's interesting that things which were developed for disabled people turned out to be really good for the mainstream and have moved from as being assistive technologies to just good things that everyone wants. And I've got 3 examples here, which are all products. They're not digital things. I'm not sure why I came up with 3 products, but they're interesting stories. So the car is a Ford Focus. Now, the Ford Focus was designed specifically for older drivers, and they went through a very thorough design process. They put their designers in third age suits where they kind of made their hands more difficult to gave them less dexterity and all kinds of things. You can read about it, the third age suit. It's very interesting. That turned out to be the most successful mid-range car that Ford ever has made. And the marketing people wouldn't let them talk about older users. So no one outside the community actually knows that the reasons it's so successful is because it was built for older users or designed for older users. Similarly, the vegetable scraper in the middle is an OXO Good Grips, and they were designed for people with arthritis. And they were so successful, they're not now marketed for people with arthritis. They're just marketed as good products because they work really well for everybody. And I discovered one of the designers who worked on those projects is called Dan Formosa, and he's got a very funny and interesting YouTube channel where he evaluates consumer products, and he talks about usability and he talks about accessibility. He puts oil on his hands to decrease his dexterity and tries to use the consumer products. It's a great channel. I recommend having a look. And finally, the big button phone. That's a phone from British Telecom in the UK. Again, that was designed for older people who couldn't see the buttons and couldn't touch the buttons. It was the best-selling phone they've ever made. They discovered people liked to have it because they could make phone calls in the night without having to turn on the light, and all kinds of stories around the strange users. But it turned out to be very popular with everybody. So things which are designed to be good for disabled people turn out to be good for everybody. So I need to move on. Designing new technologies or using new technologies to help disabled and older people. Here, I'll just talk about one example from my work with people with visual disabilities, because there are many interesting developments across all kinds of problems and helping people with all different kinds of disabilities. But people with visual disabilities, I often think, have two big problems in life. One is accessing visual printed information, be that text, graphics, images. We've talked a bit about screen readers for that. But the other is navigating your way around the world when you can't see very well. And the second project I worked on, strangely, the first one having been on access to information, then I was still working at the RNIB, and I was asked to work on, in fact, it was the first project in the world to use the GPS satellite system to create a navigational aid for blind people in particular. And in those days, I don't think any of us had seen an in-car system for drivers, which of course I think was being developed in parallel. And in fact, the GPS signal was still a military signal, and it was kind of distorted so people wouldn't misuse it in some ways. But we were lucky that we had British Telecom as a partner, and they had special extra transmitters so we could decode the GPS signal and make it very accurate, because for a pedestrian, you need it to be very accurate. And these devices have really taken off and have really transformed the lives of visually impaired people, giving them far greater independence to go to places that they've never been before and find their own way, one of the things I loved was, I remember we did a lot of interviews with disabled people about what would they want from a device like this and how should it work. And they said, the problem is sighted people don't seem to know where they are. And if you ask them, they can't give you accurate directions. So they couldn't understand why sighted people who can rely on landmarks and signs were so poor at navigating themselves, supposedly. So we've got lots of devices now. And one of the things that's happened, which has been really great, is when we were first working, you had to have a laptop with you to run the software. Or then when they became commercial, the first systems were dedicated, small, in effect, laptop devices. And blind people said, I don't want to carry another device with me. I've got my note taker, I've got my laptop, I've got my guide dog or my white cane, and now you want me to have this other thing that's going to talk to me while I navigate through the world. So with the advent of smartphones, now all these are apps on smartphones, and there are a number of different ones. And interestingly, now they are mainly free. I only realized this quite recently. So there's a free app for the Apple called Lazzarino. I'm not sure what that means. And there's one for Android called Dot Walker. Now, you still use these in conjunction with a long cane or a guide dog to find your, what I call micro navigation. Where exactly should I put my feet now? But they provide macro navigation. So there's still an issue, and research needs to be done on, can we provide better information to people for micro navigation? That's a really tough one, because a long cane is very good at micro navigation. And there are laser canes. They've been around for a while. They don't add enough benefit for the effort of using them. But an interesting, there are a number of interesting challenges apart from that one. One is the last 10 yards problem, what I call the last 10 yards problem of a GPS device will navigate you to a building, but finding exactly where the door is or where the letterbox is still beyond the capability of a GPS. So you need another system for that. Another problem is finding your way in a big open space, like a big piazza or a big airport concourse or a train station, particularly because blind people, because they're not getting feedback visually from the environment, they tend to veer. So they find it hard to walk in a straight line, which I find fascinating because I'm sighted, but I veer strongly as well. I don't know why. And of course, indoors, you don't have GPS. So people are looking at different systems, but indoor navigation is still a very active area. So just quickly to mention, I talked about how products which were developed for as assistive technology or specifically for people with disabilities then became mainstream, but they were mainstream products in a way. Well, and this is another group which I find really interesting, of products which were originally specifically for a particular disability problem, which have now just become mainstream and everyone seems to have forgotten. So this is something I read about a long time ago, and I now can't find the reference. But I was reading a book on the development of audio books for blind people. And that book talked about the fact that now, if you're younger than me, you may not even know what I'm talking about here, but 33 1/3 vinyl records were actually developed because before that, people had 78 records. I don't remember 78 records. I'm not that old, but they couldn't contain enough of a book to be useful. So that the development of the 33 1/3 record, vinyl record, was actually for blind audiobooks. I would really love to verify that because I can't find it. But certainly the cassette tape recorder was developed because reel-to-reel tape recorders were very hard for people with dexterity problems. So the initial input in Philips was to create a tape recorder that was easier for people with dexterity problems, and they came up with the cassette, which then went on to have a huge life and has now disappeared again. And finally, more recently, predictive text that we all have on our phones. That definitely was developed for people with speech disabilities. I actually know the people who did it at Dundee University in the UK, and now it's on everybody's phone and we all rely on it. So these are developments working in the other direction. They were invented to solve a specific problem and then became a very broad product. So finally, just a few words on methods of working with disabled and older people in HCI, because a lot of young researchers I work with worry about, well, how are we going to work? How are we going to do HCI work with disabled and older people? And generally, we use exactly the same methods. We do interviews, focus group, think aloud studies, experiments, and we have to make some minor changes to the method to accommodate. If people can't see something, for example, we have to think about, are we going to put it into a tactile? So I've made tactile licket items, for example, or are we just going to say it in speech? But occasionally we come up with an interesting twist to a method. And recently we've come up with a method which I call Conciliary Evaluation, which is a variation of Think Aloud. And it's inspired by The Godfather. I'm not promoting the mafia here, but the idea is that we have now lots of applications that we need to evaluate for accessibility and help people develop for accessibility. And you need to have an expert knowledge. They're in a particular complicated domain. This started when we were asked to look at banking applications, not for the customers, but for the people working in banks. Was the software accessible? But the software in the banks requires an understanding of financial transactions. And because there were no blind people who could use the software, we couldn't find any blind people who could do the evaluation. So we came up with this idea that the evaluator would be a blind person using a screen reader, but they would have a conciliary, an advisor, who would be someone who worked in the bank, who understood the financial transaction, who would give them information about the financial aspect. And then we found that actually screen reader users are very shrewd in the way they use bits of information, and they would pick up on things that the conciliary said and use that to figure out what was happening in the software. And that wasn't what we wanted. We wanted to see, could they use it just with their knowledge of the screen reader and not the financial knowledge. So we introduced a third person to the evaluation that we called the enforcer, who's someone who understands accessibility and usability and make sure, and actually it takes quite a bit of practice and going through a few iterations, but make sure that the conciliary doesn't give away, doesn't leak information that's going to tell you where you're going to find information on a page or what order things are going to be on a page. So you still have to find where things are. So the blind person still does a think aloud. It's still a think aloud study, but not just with one facilitator, with a conciliary and an accessibility expert. And we found this was actually really interesting to do. We've had someone from the software team sit in as well, and then they can see what the problems are. The blind person can explain to them and often suggest improvements, so it becomes a redesign session as well. So I won't go into the last two slides because I'm running out of time, but I've written a paper recently about a case study where it explains how it works and the kind of problems we encountered. So I wanted to end on something I'd done recently. I've also written a chapter with Chris Power that Andre mentioned at the beginning of the talk about how to work with disabled and older people. And I've written a review with one of my research fellows, Jenny Dazentas, about technology for older people, a review of all the recent literature that I've drawn on here. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you to all my colleagues and students who've contributed to all this research. I wouldn't have been able to do it by myself, and I'm happy to answer a few questions. So.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's been an amazing talk, very inspiring. And what I can say is that I think that there are very few people in the world who would be able to give us such an all-rounder talk on accessibility from different angles, talking about the history, where we've come from, what has happened, and pointing directions to future research in the area. So really, thank you very much. This is very special. The Brazilian community has grown a lot in terms of in interest in accessibility research. So I think your talk has been an amazing opportunity for a lot of reflection for many of us here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure. I think I can give an overview because I've been around a long time now. And I've seen the field grow a lot, which has been good.
Definitely. So that's why we're really grateful because I really do think this is a unique opportunity for all of us. So thank you very much. We'll be a bit short on time, but I think we can still take 2 or 3 questions. We have some of them here. So the first one here was from Marcelo Martins. Thanks for sharing knowledge. I am a researcher in accessibility. What do you think of the challenges faced in the development of assistive technologies in the midst of the pandemic?
That's a really interesting question. And I think when the pandemic started, we were all very scared about how are we going to do HCI research when we can't meet people. And I think it's still very difficult, but in the pandemic, I've done an evaluation of the accessibility. In fact, it was the accessibility of one of the health apps that was developed to help people in COVID with blind people using Microsoft Teams. So we sent the blind participants information to their email addresses, and then we got on Teams and we talked to them and we recorded the sessions. And that showed some difficulties that, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, not everyone was familiar with Teams and Zoom, and that they had accessibility problems. So it is possible to do research remotely, but it is much harder and much more time consuming. And I think it's harder to build relationships with people and for them to really be able to talk to you. So, I hope one day the pandemic will be over and we can go back to more face-to-face. But it is possible to continue research with a lot of effort.
Thank you, Helen. That was a very good comment for the question here. We have another one here from Ludmila. So it has some parts. Thank you so much, Professor Helen, for the wonderful lecture. Do you believe that features made available on social media to insert alternative texts and images improve the experience of blind people on social media? There's a bit more. And if so, how can we researchers help to popularize these resources?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. I think having descriptions and images on social media does help, even if they're not perfect descriptions, because they at least give some insight into what the image is about. Twitter introduced an image description alt tag like you would find in HTML. And I think they introduced it in about 2017, 2016. And we actually did a study at the beginning of the pandemic. No, just before the pandemic. And nobody knew about it. So they hadn't done anything to publicize it. And there was a strange problem. Now, I may have this wrong, so don't go and check. But depending on how you access Twitter, I think if you access Twitter on your phone, there's no indication that there's an alt text there. But if you access Twitter on the web through a browser, there is one or the other. So that was a mistake by Twitter. So I think we as researchers need to pressurize the social media companies to make the alt text more visible to everybody. So sighted people would see a little icon and they think, oh, what's that? And they click on it and they see an alt text and they can get an explanation of why it's there. Because I think the other real problem is getting people to do alt texts that are useful. And they can be very short on social media. But we did a study where we got people to write alt texts on their images on Twitter, and they were hopeless. Andre may remember the examples we had of alt text of blah blah blah, and it's a cat. You need a little bit more than that. So I think, but they could gamify it, for example. They could turn it into a bit of a game for people. So I think there's research and there's publicity, and I think that's worth doing. Definitely a good area to research at the moment.
Thank you very much, Helen. I think we can still take one more question here. I think we have one from Soraya Pric. You might have met her. Soraya is one of our accessibility chairs in the event this year. Okay. So that's interesting to acknowledge. That's a new addition to the IHC this year. So thank you for your talk, Helen. Our recurrent request of international conference reviewers is to question why there are not researchers with disabilities in the team. However, in the Global South, we have few people with disabilities in master's degrees or PhD programs, and even a smaller number in the HCI area. How can we be in equal conditions to be published as the Global North groups who have many researchers with disabilities?
That's a very interesting comment. I think that's it's not a fair comment from reviewers, in the sense that you don't necessarily need people with disabilities on your team. I mean, we also don't have that many people with disabilities who are HCI researchers, to be honest, in the North. But I think to show really good involvement of people with disabilities in the research is the most important thing to me. To have a panel of people, and when you write papers, you really show how they contributed to the research. How did you involve them in the design, in the evaluation, that they weren't just the participants. And I have to say, if you look at my papers, sometimes it looks as if they're just participants, particularly in the early papers, and that's not so good. But often I find it's one of the people involved in the evaluation comes up with a really good idea that we then use. So I think the important thing to me when I'm reviewing papers is to show that the people who are going to use the system, the disabled or older people, how would they really involved in the research? And that doesn't have to mean they're on the team, the development team, but they're part of some panel, or they are part of the team, but in a different way. So I think you have to show that clearly in your writing. And then if they say no, that's just not fair. Not fair. I'm sorry.
That's great, Helen. Thank you very much. And that's going to be part of a discussion we're going to have at the Latin American Conference on HCI with representatives on the difficulties of doing accessibility research in the Global South, which goes a lot in line with what Helen was commenting. We have a couple more comments here, but I'm afraid we won't have enough time to take all of them. So many people thanking you here, Helen. Some comments from people who are using collaborative heuristic evaluation methods. So saying, very good to be here with you. I'm sorry for the later questions that arrived, but I'd like to invite you to email them to Helen if you don't mind, Helen. Some people would like to hear from you on your views on HCI helping autistic children and what you think needs to evolve in HCI research and research with the deaf community. So many very good questions. It's very sad that we will have a short time here, but I would like to invite you to send them all to Helen. I'm sure she'll have good points to say to you.
Yeah. Shall I put my email address in the chat? Will everyone see it? So I'm very happy to have discussions over email.
Oh, sure. I'll replicate your email there.
Yeah. You know what?
Oh, yes. I'll just replicate it there. So another good thing that I'd like to say to everyone, I didn't say in the introduction, but I think we need to say a public thank you to Helen. Helen is now editor-in-chief of the Interacting with Computers journal, and has agreed to organize a special issue on HCI in Latin America with papers from our conference, from the Latin American HCI conference, and the Mexican HCI conference. So thank you very much, Helen, for that as well. And me and you, Helen, if you'd like to invite people to submit other papers to the journal.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm very happy that I want to bring research in HCI in your part of the world to the world, so that people in other parts of the world can see what good research you're doing. So I'm really looking forward to that. But also, if people have papers they want to submit to the journal anyway, we do get quite a lot of papers from Brazil, which is great. So keep up the submitting of papers, please. Yeah,
that's good. So I'd like to end this with another big thank you, Helen, for this talk. It's been amazing, a unique opportunity, as I said. We'd really like to invite you to come here in person, as back in 2009. We do have a lot of people from Fortaleza in the organization.
Right, yeah.
You've met many of the colleagues there when you went to Web Media. But we do hope the pandemic, as I said, will be over soon, and that we'll be able to see you face to face again. And thank you very much.
I would be delighted to come back. So best wishes to Brazil, and good luck with your conference. And I look forward to seeing interesting papers for the special issue when they come in. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you very much to everyone who has attended this talk. Thank you to everyone who made your questions, and I hope you enjoy the other sessions of the conference.
Yes.
We're now going for Little HCI, which is a new addition to the conference series involving children and parents. So let's see what some of the kids, including mine, have produced in terms of material. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you to the interpreters as well.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much.
It was great to have an interpreter talk. So thank you. Thank you for that. Okay. Very nice to see you all. See you all again soon.
See you soon. Bye-bye.